Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. We have something out of the ordinary in a really good way, something special tonight. We are joined by Dr. Adam Jortner. Dr. Jortner is a professor of history at Auburn University. He's actually more than that. He is the Goodwin Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion. So he is a scholar of religious history, Christianity specifically, but several other religions as well, both in American history and in world history. If you don't know what that means, just think about if Nick Saban or Brian Harsin came to Concord to do a football camp, and then you kind of got a context for how big a deal this is. Dr. Jortner was one of my professors at Auburn, and not only is he one of the smartest men that I've ever met, but he's also one of the kindest. Over 4 years at Auburn, I got to watch someone who's not just passionate about history and helping others get excited about that as well, but I watched somebody who legitimately cared for his students. Cared for their well-being, cared for what they were learning. It's difficult to overstate the impact that Dr. Jortner has had on my life. And just over the last 2 years, especially during COVID, he and I have kept up a friendship, and he's been so kind to continue to check on me and ask how the church is doing. And we've talked about our families and a variety of things. And when he learned some of the things that we were doing, precautions we were taking to keep one another safe, and these are similar things that he's been advocating for at Auburn and in the community. He asked if there's anything he could do that might lift folks' spirits, something that they might find interesting, a talk or a subject he could speak on that would be out of the ordinary, that you might be interested in. So we kicked around a few ideas and settled on how Jews and Jewish people read the Old Testament. Both how have they done that in the past, and how do Jews today read the Old Testament? What do they think about it? How does that differ from a Christian approach? We have two different religions, two different traditions that are approaching the same set of scriptures in the Hebrew scriptures of the Old Testament. And so this is well within his wheelhouse as an expert in history. And I trust that you will find it as enjoyable as I did to sit and listen to it. So he is going to not only lecture on how Jews approach the Old Testament, but he's going to answer several questions from folks at Concord at the very end. So stay tuned for that for sure. He answers some really common questions, some really good questions that folks here have asked about Judaism. So with that said, I'm going to get out of his way. I trust you will enjoy. I'm super grateful for Dr. Jortner being with us tonight.
Thanks, Brother Kurt, and thanks to everybody from Concord Baptist Church. It is a great honor for me to be here today talking to this empty room, but also talking to you through the magic of the virtual world. As I said, it's a real pleasure to be here speaking with you. Pastor Kurt was my student many years ago, and I'm just pleased as punch to see how he's come along and very proud of the work he's doing here. And he's been keeping me in touch with what you all have been doing during the pandemic. And part of the reason I'm happy to be here is that I just want to say thank you. That what you are doing is really difficult. The challenges of being a church community during a pandemic, during a Delta surge, is really hard. And we kind of live in a society today where people are always letting you know when you've done something wrong. We have no problem telling people when they have made a mistake. We love that. But when people are doing the right thing, when they are tackling long-term difficult projects as a church community, people don't usually say thank you. So I'm hopeful that this will be my chance to say thank you for what you're doing, for keeping yourselves safe, keeping our community safe, and all the work you all are doing for Lee County, for the state of Alabama. I'm really impressed, and I wanted to say thank you. I don't know if you're going to think this is a great thank you. It's not like I'm baking you a cake, but I can give you a talk to many more of you than I could possibly bake a cake for. I want to talk today about how Jews read the Bible and the ways in which it's different from the way Christians, particularly Protestant Reformed Christians, read the Bible. Now, why would we ever do that? Why would you ever want to find out how someone else reads the Bible? I always say that we do it to learn more about other people. We don't learn about other cultures and other religions to change what we think, but we learn it to find out what other people think and to understand it. That is to say, whenever I teach world religions to students at Auburn, which is something I'm very fortunate to do, it's something I love to do, But I always make the point before I start that we're not talking about, we don't talk about right and wrong when we describe things, but that doesn't mean that every religion is equal. We talk about religions being different, and I think it's important for us to understand those differences, and that doesn't mean that, everybody is the same. We're not. In fact, you're going to learn, hopefully tonight, how very different, how two traditions that are really similar, Christianity and Judaism, take very different views of the Bible. But I always also tell folks when they might be concerned about learning about different religions that I would never say something that I wouldn't think a missionary wouldn't want to know, right? And I've had friends who have gone off to be Christian missionaries in countries where missionaries are not allowed, and I won't say any more about that, but they're back now, so no risk is being taken here. But they always tell me that understanding the culture they're going into is the first step towards being a missionary. So if I can help in that way, that's what I'm doing. And I always want to make a point that knowing more about people promotes patience. And you all, I think, given what you've done in the pandemic, y'all exceed me in patience. So here we go. Let's talk a little bit about this. Let me ask the question to open up. Do Christians and Jews really share the same scriptures? And in one sense, that's really easy. Yes. Christians and Jews both share the Old Testament. Let me bring up a word about words here. When I talk about the Old Testament, that's obviously a Christian term because Christians have a New Testament. Jews usually refer to the Old Testament as either the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H. That's an abbreviation for the way the Jews divide up the Old Testament. And Jews divide the Old Testament into three sections. The Torah, the law. The Torah is the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The Nevi'im, the prophets, Isaiah, Amos, etc. And the Ketuvim, the writings. And the writings is anything that's not a Torah or a prophet is a writing. So Job, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. Those are the Ketuvim, the writings. So you have Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. You take the first Hebrew letters of those, you get the word Tanakh. But a good Hebrew Bible is a good neutral term because it refers to the Bible that's in Hebrew. That's the Old Testament. That's also the Tanakh. It's a nice flexible term. They all mean the same thing. Hebrew Bible is the Tanakh, is the Old Testament. That is the scriptures that Jews and Christians share. But of course, Christians focus on the New Testament, right? Duh. Okay, the New Testament is the critical moment of history. This is the moment that brings everything else into focus. Indeed, most people who are born into the Christian religion begin with the story of Jesus Christ before they can even read. So again, I can say this shapes the way Christians view the Bible, but of course it does. The story of the Christian religion, if I can deeply oversimplify it, has its climax with the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is why the Bible is written. So that is, of course, how Protestants are going to see the Bible. But there's still more to it than that. Because the New Testament is not just gospel stories of Jesus Christ, but also the letters of Paul and others, but here mostly Paul. And Paul also has things to say about the Hebrew Scriptures. One of his constant refrains is that the Jewish tradition that Jesus comes out of, the Old Testament, has been improved and replaced. And he talks about this at numerous points, but I just picked one in particular, Romans 7:4-6. And Paul writes, "You have also died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him that has been raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Now, in this particular quote, it's very useful because when Paul is talking about the law, he means the Torah, right? Torah means law. You have died to the law through the body of Christ that you may belong to another. So law has been superseded through the body of Christ. And indeed, he goes on he gets even more specific in 7:6. But now we are released from the law so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit, and here it comes, not the old way of the written code. Paul couldn't be any more specific here. He's talking about the old way, the written law, which is the Torah. So the law has been overcome in Paul's, and this is, again, Paul talks about this all the time. But Paul goes on in Romans 7, he says, it's not that the law is bad, it's not that Torah is bad, but you're bad. The law brought sin, and no one can really live up to the law, and therefore death and resurrection replaces the law, the new way of the Spirit. So, as Paul writes, and of course Paul writes this down, it is part of the Christian New Testament, it is sacred scripture. Christians consider this the Word of God, you all know this. The law of Hebrew tradition takes an ambivalent place in Christianity. It remains, it's good. Paul doesn't say the law is wrong, but it is also replaced. Again, this is not the only time this idea shows up in the New Testament. I'm just picking an example. This is fundamental to the way Christians read the Scriptures, that the Old Testament is a prologue. That's what makes it an Old Testament. A byproduct of this may be a tendency to see the Old Testament as a kind of prototype. In Christian theology, Old Testament texts are often sort of mined for their theological meaning. Sometimes they're used as technical bits about who means what. There's lots of analysis of sort of types and anti-types, and I get very confused about that. This is not quite the way Jews read their scriptures. For Jews, the Hebrew Bible is a story about people. Folks like Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Rebekah, Moses, even Pharaoh are real people that we feel like we know. Their human foibles rise to the top. And a Christian might say, because the Jews don't have a New Testament, they don't sort of see these characters as prologue, but as sort of a real human family. This difference can lead to a misunderstanding sometimes about how Jews read the Torah and the Scriptures. Sometimes Christians have an assumption that Jews also hate the law because Paul hates the law. I mean, he loves the law, but he hates the law. You're Baptists, you know what I mean. It can lead to an assumption that Jews hate the law, but Jews don't. People who practice Judaism tend to love the law. It can lead to an assumption that Jews think that the law is a curse, but Jews, by and large, don't think the law is a curse. They love it. It shapes their lives. It can lead to an assumption that Jews are still waiting for the promised Messiah, which most Jews are not. If I could only make one point here tonight, it's that some Christians think Judaism is just Christianity without Christ, which it isn't. It's a different tradition. It shares the same scriptures, but sees those scriptures differently. I remember a friend of mine, this is 20-odd years ago when I was a much younger man, coming over to me at some point and saying, I just don't understand one thing about Jews. Why don't y'all dig on Jesus? Now, she and I may or may not have been drinking heavily at this point, but I'm not going to tell you about the rest of the discussion that followed was not helpful to anyone. But she was a dedicated Christian woman, and she just couldn't understand why Jews didn't see Jesus in their scriptures. And I've thought about that as when I became older and realized that, alcohol, not the best. And I sort of realized that was her impression of Judaism, was that they thought Jews were still waiting for Jesus. And I don't think that's an accurate depiction. So, what is Judaism about? How do they read the Bible? Judaism has its own way of reading the Bible and its own assumption about what it means and how to actually go about reading it that are radically different. I might put it this way. Christians read the Old Testament alongside the sacred writings of Paul and the New Testament. Jews read the Old Testament alongside the Talmud and the Mishnah, the Midrash. So let me give you a few minutes on how Jews are actually going to read the Bible and what exactly Midrash is anyway. First of all, I want to talk about how Jews normally read the Torah here in the 21st century. Before I give you a history lesson, how did Jews read the Bible? Well, first of all, almost all Jewish reading of the Scriptures is limited to the Torah. Okay, of the Old Testament, Jews read the Torah the most. In fact, they begin their new year by starting. They start at a holiday called Simchas Torah. You finish reading Deuteronomy and you immediately start reading Genesis. You read the last line of Deuteronomy. You read Genesis 1:1 because it never stops. But you read the whole Torah through the cycle of the year, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. That's everything in the Torah, folks. Even the boring parts. You don't jump around. You don't get to pick and choose. You sort of read it chronologically from Genesis all the way through, and you sort of do a different bit each week. Every Jewish community reads the same thing. It's set for the next 1,000 years. And so when there's an event in your community or the nation that sort of demands that a rabbi sort of pay attention to it, for example, if there's, a pandemic or a war or a day of mourning, Jews can't sort of break in and say, well, this week I feel like talking about Ecclesiastes, or I know we're on Deuteronomy, but I want to talk about Exodus. You can do that, but you still got to cover the reading for that week. So, for example, of course, when a Jew becomes 13, he or she can have a bar or bat mitzvah to become considered a full member of the community. And you actually read from the Torah for the first time, and you have to give a little homily about the Torah portion. So again, if we start reading in Genesis in October. So my brother, who was born in December, when it was his bar mitzvah, it was time for the story of Jacob wrestling the angel. And it was great, and Dave had a lot of interesting things to say about it. And then I was born in March, and when my turn came, it was March, so we were reading Leviticus, and I had to talk about the meal offering. I did not have as much to say about that as David did, and my beloved sister is unfortunately born in May, and she got stuck with Numbers 1, which is the census. And again, next time if you want to make it really challenging, if you're hiring a pastor, maybe you say, all right, you got to give us a sample sermon, but it's got to be on Numbers 1. That'll really tell you. Don't really do that. Numbers 1 is the census. It's real hard to talk about. But that is just sort of how it is. You sort of go through everything, even the parts we would consider boring. Protestants, at least in terms of preaching, do tend to jump around quite a bit. It does mean Jews have a great familiarity with the people in the Torah. Again, you're reading these stories again and again and again, and the heartache of those stories is something I think most Jews become very familiar with. I always talk about the story of Sarah. Sarah, of course, wife of Abraham, very old, never has children, and an angel shows up and tells Abraham that Sarah's going to have a kid, and Sarah laughs at that. And the angel comes to Sarah, and of course the angel says, "Why did you laugh?" And Sarah says, "I didn't laugh." The angel says, "You did laugh." That's a very human story. It's a very human tragedy of this woman who desperately wants a child, but can't believe she's going to have it, and then she screws up right in front of the angel. The story of how Sarah turns away from Hagar, enslaved to Abraham and Sarah, by whom Abraham has a child. For most Jews, this isn't an allegory. This is a very human tragedy. Sarah screws, I don't want to say she screws up, but she does. She does a wrong thing. God preserves Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, of course. But that's a mistake that Sarah makes that we read about every year, the poignancy of this woman who makes a terrible mistake. So Jews read the Torah extensively, but they rarely read the prophets, which are so important to Christians, and they rarely read the writings. They do sometimes, but again, not every week, year after year. That's the Torah. So Christians will sometimes ask Jews, do you not see these prophecies from Isaiah, from Ezekiel being fulfilled in Jesus? And Jews usually answer, what are you talking about? Part of the reason Jews respond this way is, first of all, they don't read those prophets very much, but more importantly, there is no Paul at the end of the Scriptures. There is no New Testament at the end of the Scriptures. And because Jews actually have another set of sacred scriptures that they read as they're reading the Torah. Those sacred scriptures are the Midrash. The Midrash, which might be called, real quick, the teachings of the rabbis. These are commentaries on the Torah itself, first by learned rabbis, and then sort of going on to the present. So this is a process of commentary on the text itself, which begins around 200 BC and continues on to the present. Where does Midrash come from? It begins around 200 BC in the wake of the conquests of Alexander the Great, when Greek learning comes to Judea. And you begin to get people called rabbis who begin teaching at synagogues. Now, the word rabbi doesn't occur in the Torah. Rabbis are a later invention. The word synagogue isn't even Hebrew, it's Greek, meaning coming together. These are community centers for Jews living in the Roman Empire who don't live in Judea. Again, ancient Hebrew religion has to be centered in Jerusalem. You have to perform the sacrifices at the temple. But if you don't live in Judea, you can still be Jewish in the year 100 BC because you'll have a rabbi and a synagogue where Jews will sort of get together and the rabbis will teach about the scriptures. And the rabbis take this Torah and they begin making commentary. There are two major versions of Midrash, the Mishnah and the Talmud. You don't have to know it. There's differences between them. I'm going to skip the differences, but they're both real old. Mishnah and Talmud are both these sets of commentaries. And for about 300 years, Rabbinic Judaism kind of lives alongside as a kind of competitor with Temple Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is mobile. It can exist anywhere, and it relies on works of loving kindness and good deeds. The rabbis teach something like what the prophets say, rend your heart and not your garments. What God wants is acts of loving kindness, particularly acts of loving kindness to the poor, more so than sacrifices. Temple Judaism is in Jerusalem, and it relies on sacrifices. I'm not going to get into the weeds here of the basics of Judaic history in the Roman period, but when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, Temple Judaism is over. But Rabbinic Judaism has already begun and taken root throughout the Roman world. So modern Judaism is not the same as the Hebrew religion described in the Old Testament. There are no more sacrifices. There is no more priestly class. Modern Judaism is its own tradition that begins with the Torah and continues in the Midrash. So how does Midrash, and of course that is what survives, that is what takes root in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, and it goes as far as China and India, down into Ethiopia. And the Midrash is, the major canons of Midrash are finished around the year 600, but it continues till today. People still write it. Okay, so what is Midrash and how does it work? A Midrash takes a text of the Torah and interprets it, often giving new or slightly different teachings that add to the text. So Midrash takes a text of Torah, reads it, and draws out different meanings that accompany the text. Let me give you an example. Genesis 4:10. The text, this is when Cain kills Abel, and Genesis 4:10, God tells Cain, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Okay. The Midrash for this text, and there are many Midrashim for this, but one of the Midrashes says, okay, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. But the Hebrew actually reads, Demei achicha. And Demei is plural. Your brother's bloods are crying out from the ground. What could that mean? The interpretation is Abel's unborn descendants are also crying out from the ground. From this, the rabbis conclude, a single life is equal to all of creation. Okay, because Genesis 4:10 uses the plural bloods, the Midrash says, well, that must mean it's not just Abel crying out, it is all of the unborn descendants he would have had also crying out from the ground. And therefore, we learn that if you destroy one life, you destroy a whole world. And from that, the rabbis begin to build an argument that, again, the preservation of human life is the highest possible value. Again, doesn't contradict the Bible, but it begins to add to it. It also involves sort of taking notes from the text. For example, one of the Midrashic teachings comes from Deuteronomy 4:9, which is sort of just a discussion about sort of where you're going to put the ark. Actually, I can probably look it up. Wait a minute. I wrote down Deuteronomy 4, but luckily I'm in a church. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen and do not depart from your heart all the days of your life. Okay, remember the things that I'm teaching you. And again, the Midrash argues, or makes sort of talk a great deal about this, and they say it is important that you remember, do not forget the things your eyes have seen, and do not let them depart from your heart. Why those two things? The rabbis in this case argued, what we're talking about here is intentional forgetting. If you can't recall something because it's often not on the tip of your tongue, or you sort of are just, you forgot to remember, just because you memorized it really hard and you forgot something, that's not what this verse is talking about. If you let it depart from your heart, you are intentionally letting things slip. You're letting things get out of hand. You did it. You don't sort of forget on purpose, but you might not review. You might not remember to remember. That's what this verse means. So again, that's the commentary. Midrash also involves sort of taking notes about the text, sort of noticing interesting things. Another great example is the story of the binding of Isaac in Genesis. This is a very important story for Christians as well, because Christians see this as a precursor to what will happen to Jesus. Abraham is called on to sacrifice his son. He's stopped. God is called on to sacrifice his son. He will not be stopped. But the Midrash notices a few things about this story by looking at what happens afterwards. First of all, the rabbis note that one thing that happens is that when Abraham and Isaac go up, there's a Hebrew word there that means the two of them together. Isaac and Abraham go up, the two of them together. When they come back down, that Hebrew word is missing. And the rabbis say, that's interesting. They're coming down, but not the two of them together. Interesting. And then the rabbis, of course, notice three interesting things about the story that don't happen. After the binding of Isaac, three things happen. Isaac never talks to Abraham again. Sarah never talks to Abraham again. And God never talks to Abraham again. And of course, the thing that happens immediately after the binding of Isaac is the death of Sarah. Which turns, again, and this is not an exclusively Jewish interpretation, but it does sort of turn the emphasis of the story from a preview of God's own sacrifice to a story of a great family tragedy. That something was done here, that Abraham did something that broke his family. And some rabbis say possibly that broke his relationship with God. And, again, I'm not going to get into the weeds here. But to focus not on the Abraham's obedience to God, which is the usual story you would get in Protestantism, but to focus on the cost or the tragedy that ensues. Whatever, maybe we could sort of say that this story, what the rabbis get into, more than was Abraham right, is more of the human dimension that can't be missed. This is not just a story of a faithful follower of God obeying the commands of God, because if you do that, you're missing the story of this family that is then broken apart. And indeed, you can sort of see, well, so what are the rabbis teaching about that? And the answer is they teach a lot of things, because the Midrash disagrees with itself. The Midrash is not one collection. There are many collections, and people who study this stuff, do this, and people who sort of make a profession of doing Midrash, absolutely know that you can read in these things and you can see different rabbis are having arguments with one another. And all the arguments end up in the text of the Midrash. So what are we talking about here? Well, for example, famously, you are not supposed to work on the Sabbath. You shall do no work on the Sabbath day. What is work? Okay, building a bridge, that's definitely work. What about driving? Is that work? What about flipping a light switch? What about playing volleyball? Are these things work? Well, one group of rabbis from Exodus 35, goes to Exodus 35, 1 through 3. There's a commandment there which forbids work on the Sabbath, which is then followed by a description of the tabernacle. So this group of rabbis says, okay, any work that could possibly be done on the tabernacle must be the work that's forbidden during the Sabbath. So according to part of the Mishnah, there are 29 major kinds of work that are forbidden. They were all involved in making the tabernacle, including sewing, reaping, baking, tying or untying a knot, lighting a fire, or moving things from one place to another. So by extension, driving would be forbidden, because when you drive, you create a small spark to light the engine. That's lighting a fire and therefore forbidden. There are Jews who will not drive on the Sabbath. Similarly, under this explanation, you could not play volleyball if you had to raise the net because you'd have to tie a knot. But if the net was already up, you could probably do it. There are other interpretations, however, also in the Midrash, that sort of say, no, the only prohibition is lighting a fire, because that one is specifically mentioned. It is, when it says do no, the only time it actually gets absolutely clear on it in Exodus is when they say do no work. And by the way, lighting a fire is definitely work. I'm paraphrasing. So it's only lighting a fire. And there are still other groups of rabbis, again in the Midrash, as again, this is a 20th century reading, which says what matters is intentionality. If you intend to light a fire, that would be work. When you are driving, you're not intending to light a fire. You are intending to drive a car. The purpose of driving the car, the spark you create, is not the work that is done there, or not the activity that's done. So driving would be okay. And this leads us, of course, to the three modern divisions of Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. And much of the difference between Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform is how strictly, what kind of laws from the Midrash will you follow. The Orthodox adhere to the strictest possible interpretation of the rabbis in the Midrash and usually favor older rabbinic interpretations so that they can live, and the purpose being to live a sacred and divine life. Reform Jews will adhere to the rabbinical teachings and tradition wherever possible to live a sacred and divine life. They tend to favor more modern interpretations. So again, the Orthodox are the ones who would not drive a car on the Sabbath. Reform Jews would drive a car on the Sabbath, saying again here, what's the intention? The intention is not to create a fire, it is to drive from place to place. And the Reform Jews would argue that there are times when adhering to strict midrashic interpretations actually prevents you from living a sacred and divine life. And there are the conservative Jews who split the difference. And conservative Jews are just open about this. We're going to split the difference. A great example of sort of how does this work practically has to do with ordination of women as rabbis. Reform Jews begin discussing it in 1922. Can we have women as rabbis? Which, of course, the older midrashic texts say no. More modern says, well, we don't think there's anything wrong with having a woman as rabbi. It's the learning that you bring to the community, the love that you have, your acts of kindness. So Reform Jews start talking about ordaining women in the 1920s. They finally actually do ordain women in the 1970s. Orthodox Jews do not ordain women. And conservative Jews started ordaining women, but 20 years after the Reform Jews did it, and only when sort of one guy on their board died. This is a true story. There was one guy on the conservative board who was just dead set against ordaining women, and he passed away, and 3 weeks later, conservatives were like, okay, now we're going to have women. And from that story, I conclude that Baptists and Jews are maybe not so different. All three of these groups, by the way, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, would agree to violate any rabbinical law in order to save a life, with the exception of the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. Other than that, it is established in all branches of Judaism that your first job is to preserve a life. So if you're Orthodox and you have to drive on Shabbat to save a life, then that's what you have to do. I should point out there is a small group of Jews known as the Hasidim or the Hasids. These are the guys in the big hats with the long beards. And you normally see you normally see pictures of these guys when you take a picture of anything happening in Israel. And I was looking for a picture of the Western Wall the other day so I could show it to my class, and I had to really work to find one that didn't have Hasids in it. There is some thinking that Hasids are the entire Jewish population. Actually, they're less than 10%. Even in the state of Israel. Even in the state of Israel, most people don't wear the big broad hats and have the long payas. Hasidim live by 17th century rules created by their founder, the Baal Shem Tov. Those Jews are, by and large, waiting for a Messiah, but again, they're a minority in the Jewish community. For most Jews, life is about making every day holy. Sanctification and acts of loving kindness are the center of this religion, not really salvation. And if this is the case, then the need for a Messiah disentangles itself from Jewish teaching. The idea is there, but the Messiah becomes a more distant figure. A kind of a teaching figure. Something, it is not a major emphasis of most Jewish teaching today. Instead, there is an idea that human beings, through Midrash, through their acts as people, are helping to heal the world, something Jews call tikkun olam, which means to heal the world. But very unusual, I think, certainly unusual for Christians to think about, is the way that Jews see themselves as commenting on divine law and actually building that law. Because in traditional Judaism, the Midrash is known as oral Torah, which has the same weight as written Torah. Now that's weird, so let me just say it again. Unusual, let's say this. The oral Torah and the written Torah have the same weight, even though the oral Torah can contradict itself. How is that possible? Because each Jew is supposed to come to the laws, to the commentary, read it for themselves, and make the right decision. That is to say, Jews are, in a sense, collaborating with God. And wouldn't you know it, there's a Midrashic story about this. Again, this is one of the stories. The Midrash also has these stories of rabbis, and these are not supposed to be, I think, taken as true stories. These are sort of stories that are told about the rabbis. Anyway, the story goes that Rabbi Eleazar is having an argument with his fellow rabbis somewhere. about a particular point of Midrash, a particular point of interpretation. Everybody disagrees with Eleazar. So Eleazar stands up and he says, if I am right, may a voice from heaven come down and say so. And a voice says, Rabbi Eleazar is right. And the other rabbis stand up and they say, we do not accept testimony from angelic voices. And Eleazar stands up and he says, if I am right, may the stream outside begin to flow uphill. And the stream starts flowing uphill. And the rabbis stand up and they say, we do not take evidence from streams. And Eleazar finally stands up and he says, if I am right, may this very tabernacle be shaken to the ground. And everything starts shaking. And one of the rabbis stands up, puts his hand up, and says, that's enough. We do not take evidence from the shaking of the earth. The Torah has been put down on earth from the moment it came to us from Sinai. We have been interpreting it and ruling on it. And the story goes that the tabernacle stops shaking, and in heaven, God is laughing. God is laughing because human beings which he created have, in a sense, defeated him. That's a big statement to say. But human beings are not doing what he intended. And God sort of enjoys that. That is to say, the law came down to earth, human beings are interpreting it, and those interpretations are valid. Those interpretations count. Humans and God collaborate, which is something that Jews would say God enjoys. It certainly helps explain in Judaism why bad things happen to good people, right? Because humans make mistakes. And this is a very different way of looking at the scriptures than a standard Protestant way. It's different than the way Paul would look at it. So Jews, to an extent, believe that humans and gods work together to heal the world. And in that sense, the Torah is not just a story of divine commands. It is also a story of a divine family. And so the mistakes of Abraham and Sarah and all the rest are there not just to teach us, but also to edify us as we go, as Jews believe, as they go forward to try and make the world literally a better place. That's the way I usually end my discussion on rabbinic Judaism. I'm going to move on to some of the questions that I got here. I think I got some really, really good ones. Two big ones that that sort of came up. Do Jews believe Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus? And when do Jews believe the Messiah will come? I hope I sort of indicated there, the Isaiah 53 is not emphasized in Judaism, at least in modern-day Judaism. The idea of a Messiah is pretty distant. My guess is most Jews, if you said, well, what about Isaiah 53? Most Jews would not know what you were talking about. They would say, what's in Isaiah 53? And you would have to tell them about it. But I think Jews who are familiar with that passage don't see it as sort of a prediction of Jesus, but rather as something related to the writing of the book of Isaiah. They see it as being related. I will actually try to go ahead and look it up, because I actually, Brother Kurt told me to look it up. And again, yes, because of course for Christians, this is a big one, right? He was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening of our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. I think most Christians would say, well, who do you think it was talking about? Jews would probably see this as a reference to the people of Israel itself. But I think the real answer is the Messiah is not really an emphasis of modern Judaism. And it's the same thing about when the Messiah will come. Most Jews are simply not interested. Another way of putting that is to say, because Jews don't believe in original sin, because they don't believe in the idea that God has to come to earth and die for our sins, because they don't believe in that, Messiah is sort of not needed. It's maybe a little too cold-hearted of a way to put it, but it's simply not an emphasis. So that the idea of needing a Messiah is not one that is in Judaism, modern-day Judaism, very much. Do practicing Jews focus on keeping the whole Mosaic law or parts? If so, which parts are most important? Another great question. And then someone also asked, are there denominations in Judaism like in Christianity? There are these three divisions, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. By and large, those three are, I would say, they're like denominations, but they're actually not, they're much more like Baptists, which is to say, in Judaism, each synagogue runs itself. There are these boards, at least in the United States, there are these boards that run Reform, Conservative, Orthodox synagogues. But like the Southern Baptist Convention, the different synagogues group themselves under each organization, but they can leave anytime they want. And I think the other thing, if I may not go too far, Baptists also sort of see themselves as part of the same tradition, much more so than a Baptist would sort of say, look at another, even if you were a difference between sort of a two-in-the-seed Baptist versus a missionary Baptist, we're both still Baptists, much more so than that's the kind of attitude that Orthodox and Reformed Jews often have towards one another. That we're all sort of Jewish. We have differences on sort of minor issues. The question about keeping the whole Mosaic law or parts of it is a great question, and it has to do with which of these groups you're in. Again, the Orthodox try to maintain as much of the Mosaic law as they possibly can. Reform Jews are, I would say, less interested in keeping all the Mosaic laws, but are very interested in acts of loving kindness and in the Jewish community. Again, that is to say, the question is not kosher laws, that is to say, the laws about eating food are a clear example. Orthodox Jews really work very hard to make sure that the food that they eat is kosher. And again, if you want to know what kosher is, that's, somebody's got a bar mitzvah where they do all the laws of kosher. And then there are some animals that are banned, and then there are some, for fish, it's got to have fins and scales, and it's got to, if it's a four-legged animal, various rules. The big ones in the South are, of course, that pork and shrimp are out. Orthodox Jews try to adhere very closely to that. A conservative Jew would sort of would probably continue to be kosher in the home. But if they were eating out, they might not insist on it. They wouldn't order a shrimp taco, for example, but they would not worry about whether or not something unkosher had gotten into a beef or a chicken taco, for example. A Reformed Jew would probably say something like, my soul is not in my stomach. So what the point of a kosher law is to be sure that we are living a distinct life. And the way to do that is not necessarily through obsessing about what you can and can't eat, but on how to do good. And again, who's right? Everybody. The difference is about what you can do on the Sabbath, what you can eat, that sort of thing. These usually are not points of division between Jews. Are Jewish holidays religious or cultural? As in, is there any significance for those who are not practicing? And again, this is the really interesting thing about Judaism is, again, because Judaism is a community, it is a religion in which you don't have to go to synagogue, right? Again, you could be a good, loving person outside of the synagogue, in theory. There are lots of Jews who consider themselves Jewish but simply don't practice. Are Jewish holidays religious or cultural? They are both. Again, Judaism, much of the religion comes from the Torah, comes from the Midrash, but much also comes from the story of the Jews, after the destruction of the temple to the present. The culture that develops in Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East, and of course the history of Judaism, particularly in Europe, of eventually being segregated out from the Christian population and subjected to anti-Semitism in various fun forms. And then, of course, in the last 80 years, the experience, at least in most of Europe, the United States, Canada, Argentina, of having religious freedom and also having the state of Israel has radically changed that. So all of those things are in the holidays. And they're in, the Christian holidays are cultural too, it's just we don't notice it as much. And so when Jews celebrate their holidays, it often has significance for them for both reasons. I don't know if I answered that question in a super great way, but I think maybe the best way I could put it is, I'll put it this way: Hanukkah, probably the best known Jewish holiday. Hanukkah was a pretty minor holiday. It celebrates the defeat of a Greek army in the 140s BC, I think. I can't even remember the exact. Anyway, the Greek army is defeated, and they have to clean up the temple, and the oil that was supposed to last for 1 day lasted for 8 days. Or, as Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart put it, does Hanukkah commemorate events profound and holy? A king who said claimed to save the world? No, oil that burned quite slowly. It's not an important holiday, but culturally, Jews in the United States, when Americans begin to celebrate Christmas as a big event, and this is a whole other lecture probably, Christmas does not become a real popular holiday with the gift givings and the Santa Claus until probably the 1840s, 1850s. Once Christmas sort of arrives and becomes modern Christmas with its connotations of gift giving and family time, lo and behold, Hanukkah also sort of begins to emerge in the American Jewish calendar. That doesn't make Hanukkah not important as a religious holiday, but obviously culturally Hanukkah is there, and it has grown as sort of an alternative to Christmas. Right, it is the time when Jews will be able to give their gifts. But again, it's much more important in terms of Jewish teaching. Passover, Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. These are way more important holidays than Hanukkah. Anyway, I don't know that I answered that question super great, but I will try. 2 more questions. What is the purpose of wearing tassels on your clothes or curled sideburns in Jewish culture? A great question. There are, in the Torah, there are instructions that Jews should wear fringed garments. They should have fringes on their garments. What does that mean? Well, for many Jews, it means you're wearing your tallis, the prayer shawl that you wear during daytime services, mostly, should have fringes on it. Other Jews say, no, I'm reading in the Midrash here, and this particular Midrash says I should wear it all the time. So that is, again, it comes down to sort of where and how often are you going to do this? Which Midrash are you looking at? Again, most Jews, particularly throughout the world, but particularly in the United States, won't wear a fringed garment except during worship, and then it's a prayer shawl that you drape over your shoulders. Curled sideburns, again, that there is a line in Exodus about not letting, for the priestly class, not ever cutting the sideburn. Mostly the Hasidics have kept this up. This is something that they do. Hasidism, again, based on the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov in the 16th century, who taught everybody's a priest, so never cut. Every man is a priest, never cut your forelocks. And so that is that. Again, most Jews do not follow that. And finally, I want to ask the question, what do Jews believe about the New Testament? I hopefully I've given you my talk here today was sort of about how do Jews see the Torah and the ways in which a Jew is going to read the Old Testament because they don't have a New Testament. Um, the ideas in the letters of Paul, the story of the gospel, they're not familiar with that. And that's why they read, and they have this thing called Midrash, and that changes how they read it. So you've got two different readings. That's how Jews see the Old Testament. How do they see the New Testament? First of all, you'd have to ask. You'll probably get a different answer from every different Jew. I think it might be a better question to ask is sort of what do Jews believe about Christianity, right? And that is a hard nut to crack. I'll do my best. In my experience, most Jews consider Christianity to be a different religion, and sort of full stop. This is a different set of teachings. Many Jews are not aware of the close relationship between the early Christian church and Judaism. I think most Jews have not read the New Testament, and I think many, again in my experience, I've told several Jews, like, did you know the Gospels tell the same story? And they're stunned. They're like, wait a minute, there are 4 books, there are 4 Gospels. Yes. They tell the same story. Yes. 4 different times. Yes. Are they the same? No. What? This is very surprising to them, again, because the Old Testament doesn't work like that. You know, you start with creation and you get to Moses standing outside the land of Canaan, and no repeats. Most Jews, I think, are unfamiliar with the structure of the New Testament as to sort of how do they feel about it. I'll go ahead. I'll be sort of frank about it. I think most Jews are kindly disposed to Christianity. I think there are a good number of Jews in the United States who are sometimes frightened by the aggressiveness of certain members of the Christian community. And I'm talking about here sort of people who discuss doing things because of America as a Christian nation, or who talk about America's Christian heritage as giving them some kind of leg up on everyone else. Now, I'm not going to talk about sort of the politics of that, but I will say that there are certainly this can worry the Jewish community, which is not just, and that isn't to say that sort of, no Jews think that way, or it's certainly not true that no Jews are conservatives. There certainly are conservative Jews. I would say more closely that sort of language can frighten Jews because it has been used in the idea that there is a Christian heritage in the West, and we need to not just that this is something to celebrate and look at and pay attention to, but that it requires that we do certain things. Brings up a lot of old memories, particularly to the majority of Jews in America who are descended from Jews in Europe. That the idea of a Christian heritage was used for many centuries to keep Jews down, indeed to create pogroms. It was the idea that because the state was Christian, for example, that in all countries in Europe, Jews couldn't serve in the military as officers. They could only be drafted. Indeed, one of the things I think is really interesting about George Washington is that the first Jewish army, because he had a non-denominational army, Washington did, he actually has Jewish officers, which had not happened anywhere else. Anyway, that's a real small point there. But I think those old associations can make it difficult for some Jews to hear I'll say this, to hear the Christian message and to encounter the New Testament. I would say that is there is some concern about that. So again, if maybe brother Kurt will want to cut this part off. So I'll had a little pause there, but maybe I'll keep it in. I might say sort of my closing comment might be, people who argue about Starbucks cups that say Happy Holidays might actually be impinging their ability to spread the gospel, because when certain communities, Jewish communities, hear people yelling about coffee cups, they might get real worried. If they get this exercise about the coffee cups, then what else is going to be at stake here? Again, maybe Brother Kurt will need to cut that, but maybe we'll keep it in. So my point is, I guess, if you would take the word of a professor, and maybe you don't have to, think about if you're going to argue about the coffee cups, does that really spread the gospel? That might be a useful question to leave you with. But again, don't take my word. This is supposed to be a thank you talk. And again, if I've given you something interesting, I hope I've given you something interesting to think about. I hope something edifying. And if you have questions, we'll put this up on the screen. Jortner at auburn.edu. My last name, Jortner at auburn.edu. Always glad to take questions. And once again, thank you for all of you. Actually are doing really hard work. A lot of us are doing hard work, but you are doing hard work. And I say thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you are doing. Hang in there, and God bless.